What I want to talk today is about NAV security. I'll go through some things, how it works, and some of the misunderstandings we sometimes have seen about it, and basically talks about all the features, both how to assign user access controls, but also about roles or permission sets as they're called in 2013 and later. I'm probably going to use the roles most of the time, but it's just called permission settings in newer versions in here. Then I want to talk about some of the best practices and go through some of the roles that actually is delivered for Microsoft. And at the end, I'm going to show a free product that is called eSecurity Lite that really helps you maintain security in a much simpler way inside NAV. This one is going to be about what's inside NAV. There's other tools like FastPass, for example, that actually will have a lot of features outside NAV and will do a lot of reporting also, and a lot more for auditors. This one in general talks about the features you have within NAV for this one in here. But let's look at why security is necessary in here. A lot of times it's actually to hide data, payroll information and things like that one. You can also hide certain parts of sales data. Another reason is you also protect the data. If somebody makes a change to the posting setup, like deleting an account number, the shipping department can be down for hours until somebody finally figure out what that actually happened. And that's a really good reason to actually have security inside NAV to really protect data that people should not change by accident in here. Another thing is, of course, all the things from outside that ask you for security. Segregation of duties is a really good principle that you can have one person that can print check and another one that actually can maybe apply them, but not the same person do everything, for example. And that's what segregation of duties is about. And external requirements like Sarbanes-Oxley is also one of those things driving the need for security. It's a lot of time the reason you need security right now because the auditors come and say, you just have to do this and it has to be done within 2 months from now. So that's the reasoning for adding security in here. And there's really two things in NAV that deals with security. One is, of course, the user control. And it's really combining what is called roles or permission sets with companies in here. And that's the only place in the system where you actually have the company aspects. When you design a role, it is not related to a company at all. It's just a set up of permissions. Another thing is that permission always adds together. So when you're adding permissions to read the sales header, for example, and you also add a second line or second role with read and insert, all those permissions always add together. There's not a function that's saying denying. You can do that in Windows, but in NAV it's all about adding permissions all the time. It kind of makes it a little tougher sometimes to set up security because it's like one role that just gives the read permission can kind of override certain other things you're trying to do. Another thing is maybe you don't want to set up the user directly. You can actually use Active Directory groups, and especially for a single company setup, that's pretty good. You can have a group called Finance, you can have another one called Warehouse and things like that one. And then assign users to that group, and then when they log into NAV, they will get their own permission plus whatever is assigned to the groups a member of actually. It's not a very good idea to high-level access because a lot of times if you have super, somebody in IT can maybe change that group or have the access to the administrator password, and then suddenly they can actually do a lot of things they were not supposed to do. But let's take a look at this one here, and I'm going to use 2013 R2 to actually show this one. But very little have actually changed security-wise for NAV since the classic clients. It just looks a little different, but it's really the same features that are in here. So let's first take a look at how security is handled inside standard NAV in here. And I'll go take a look at my users. And I can look at one down here, I'll have Susan up here, for example. And I can see that Susan has a list of permissions in here. First of all, there's a permission set, and then there's also the company that that one is active in. And you can have permissions only for a single company in here, and in my database I actually have 4 companies in here. But you could also leave the company blank, permissions to any company in the database, also future companies. So that's one thing you have to be a little careful with. If you plan to add more companies in there, you really want to not use a blank company too much, for example, in here. And a lot of times, like you can see here with Susan, she can work with something in relational management, sales, receivable, and so on. You end up having quite a lot of combination of roles or permission sets and companies in here. If we look at a user like myself down here, I assigned myself the highest level of permission possible. I basically have super permissions, and then I have that access for all companies in here. So that basically means that you can do anything you want in NAV actually in here. And we will take a look at what the roles are actually done before in here. I mentioned that we can also do Active Directory groups, and I'm actually not running on a normal environment where you have a server that handles the whole Active Directory. I actually run locally, but it works the same way, and I want to show you here how you can actually set up an Active Directory group and then assign permissions that way also in there. If you have multiple companies in there, you end up kind of with the issue saying that 2 companies may be okay, because then in my database I would have Finance Europe, Finance North America, Warehouse Europe, Warehouse, and so on. If you have 10, 20 companies and so on, it can get extremely cumbersome to set up permission using Windows groups, and you get hundreds of groups out there. And that's really where you want to resort to using the security inside NAV also. Another thing is you maybe want to use this one not use it at all, because you kind of take the security out of NAV now and leave it to a whole other system. And in general, there's very little tracking of what's happening out there. So you maybe just want to leave everything inside NAV in here. But I'm going to go to my computer management in here, and where you normally would assign local users in here as Windows users, you can actually go in here and do a Windows group in here. So I'll do a new group. I'll call it Finance Europe. And I can add my members in here, and I can add Susan. And I could add Peter, for example, in here. And that's the way I would actually assign these ones in here. This one, of course, only do the part outside NAV in here. We now created this new user called Finance in here, or Finance Europe. I can now go into NAV and actually go add my new user in here. And I added Finance Europe in here, and now there's really nothing different in here. I can go up here that this one's saying it is a Windows group. That will disallow the user to actually log in, not that they would be able to anyway. But then I could go down here and actually add all the things that that user would need to do in here. And I can go in and add them in Kronos Europe and so on in here. So the user, Susan, now is both part of the permissions as she has herself, but she's also part of the Finance Europe group now that is actually administered from inside Windows in here. And that's kind of a nice concept, especially for low-level users where they don't really need NAV, and they can't really do a lot of damage if you assign it to other people, for example. You probably don't want to have the people that print checks being set up this way, or the people that assign other permissions to people, for example. The other parts, of course, is the roles in here. And roles is basically a set of permissions. It can be both for data, it can be for the objects, being all the code in NAV, and it can be for system functions. And there's absolutely no relation between a role and a company in NAV. That's only when you actually combine it underneath a user to assign access controls in that case. There also is an ability to use security filters, and I'll actually mention that one in a slide a little later, what you can do with it, and one of the problems that also occur by using that one in here. And there's no level of field security control with the standard roles inside NAV. The security system in NAV, the lowest level is a record. And that means if you can modify one field, you can modify all fields in that record, of course. So if we look at it, what can then be secured in NAV? And for the roles that comes from Microsoft, 99% of what is secured is actually only on the data level. There's a few things on the system level, but in general, there's nothing that is secured on other. You can go in and make read, insert, modify, and delete access. And you can actually both have direct access and indirect access. Indirect is kind of a half permission. It's not giving you access to do it without either going through the right code or using a function that only requires indirect permission. If you look at posting, you will have to create GL entries when you post a sales order, for example. The user can't go into the GL entry table and just start creating entries. And that's because they actually only have indirect access at that point. If you look at calculating flow fields, that's another place where a read permission actually is enough to calculate the flow fields, but you won't be able to see the permission or the record underneath. So if you want people to see the balance on the customers, but you don't want them to see the customer ledger entries, you can actually give them indirect reads on the customer ledger entry, and then they won't be able to do the drill down, but they can still calculate the total. Let me look a little more at this one in here, because let's take a look at one of the roles inside standard NAV in here instead, or permission sets in here. So if we look at this role for posting sales orders, for example, it's called sales receivable quote order invoice post in here. That role, that was to the list. I want to go to the permissions up here. I have a lot of indirect permissions in here, for example, as the GL entry, as I mentioned. You can have read, insert, modify, delete up here. And as you look at it, I have indirect permissions to actually go in and insert the entry. So it's a hard permission. I can't really do it without going through the right piece of code in here. So if we take a look at the code, I'm not going to look at a lot of details in here, but the code unit that actually is creating the entries in here is code unit number 12. It's a general journal post line. If we design that one and look at the properties, I can see in here I have permission to my GL entry table with indirect insert, indirect modify, and indirect delete in here. So, and you can't really give this one full permission. So the user always needs a half, and the code can only give you a half. And that means with the half coming from the code, it suddenly now allows me to insert the GL entries in here. And that's a very important feature. It's used multiple places in NAV actually to protect posted data, for example, in here. That the user won't be able to do anything by itself. They always have to go through the right piece of code to actually accomplish something. It's also one of the things that sometimes when you end up having customizations done, somebody forgets to add the code because a partner license actually have more access than a normal user license will have. So it's a common problem that sometimes you see that suddenly it don't work for some of these custom procedures you are getting made for yourself. But that's really about the data in here. The indirect is a very powerful way of using it, but it requires either code or some additional things in here. All the objects in NAV can actually also be controlled. It's not used a lot in general because if you have 1,000 tables in the system that you deal with on the table data, you have 2,500 pages. So just the scale of actually dealing with security on an object level actually makes it a lot harder. But some people have done it manually, and there of course exist tools out there that simplifies that process in here. There also used to be an ability to only allow people to design certain objects. It only applies to 2009 and older, since development environment in 2013 and later don't really use permissions any longer. The last piece is system tools, and that's all the functions that you actually want to limit in here. And you can go in and limit the tools for zooming and things like that one in here. You can limit access to importing objects and things like that one. Again, it's mainly in 2009 where these function works because a lot of them are very limited. In the latest builds and also in future versions, Microsoft is actually reintroducing some of these ones to prevent people from copying companies, doing backups and things like that one in here. But let's look at a role in NAV that actually uses a lot of these things in here. So if I go up and look at the basic role, that's the one that is required for login into NAV. First of all, it has a lot of data permissions in here. And one of the things it has is a user time register, for example. So it allows the user when they log in to actually modify the time registry and see how many hours they have been logged into the company and things like that one. But the other thing it has, if I go down here, is a lot of things down here with a 0. 0 is an extremely powerful permission because if you have 0, it basically applies to every object in the system. And remember that you're adding these together. So if you actually end up giving table data 0 and read, insert, modify, delete, you're basically overruling any other security that is in there because that one permission with 0 is so powerful. These things here are the object types, and you have table, report, code units, the one that exists inside the system, and you have more. The difference between table and table data is a table is a code that executes, and the only real permission that makes the difference out here is the execute permission. For table data, you never execute data. You either read it, insert, modify, or delete it at that point. So the execute permission makes no sense for table data out there. And then the last piece, of course, is these system functions down here. And if we do a lookup and see which one that exists, it's a lot of functions that are related to the technical part of the system in here. So I can actually see if they can actually use many of the functions to delete and rename companies and things like that one. Just remember in 2013, there's really only one of them right now that is actually active, and that's the one about zooming. The zooming is the function to actually do the help about, and that's the one where you would be able to see all the fields in the record, for example, in here. That is currently the only function that is actually in 2013 being able to be controlled with system permissions in here. Yeah. So we looked at this basic role, and there's a similar one called all actually for the standard classic application. It's really just the minimum permissions to log into the system. You could see we could read a lot of data. We had a few access to write, and then we could also execute every object in the system, and we got a lot of system permissions. Then there's another type of roles, and that's the one that are more kind of functional ones, like the one about creating sales orders and other documents in the system. There's system roles in there, and we looked at some of the permissions, like one of the things about Zoom in here, and this role that is called Tool Zoom is actually not in the system, but it would be a very good idea that you actually add it, so you could actually go ahead and assign that to users in here. And then you have these more kind of high-level roles, kind of bypassing the complete security system by giving almost every permission in there. It's called super and super data. But there's one extremely important difference between the super and super data in here. That super can actually administer users. They can add new users, they can delete users, they can do all kinds of things. Super can also design and change code in the system. They can run tables from the designer. Super data have complete access to the application, but is missing the ability to do all those very important functions above. So if you actually want to have users that, yeah, they should be able to use the accounting application to the fullest degree, you should not give them super. You should give them basic to log in and run all the objects, and then they should get them super data. Don't give them the super because it has so many more things it can do. So another thing is, of course, you could make a super read. If you have a person that only needs to run reports, he needs the basic to get into NAV, but then you can just give him read access to everything. And let's just create one like that one, for example, in here. So I'll create a new one in here, and I'll just call it super data read. Again, and all I'm going to do in here is to give them yes in each out here. Nothing else, and that's the only thing I really need to do in here. Just add one single line, and I have created a user that can run any jet report maybe that you want out there by simply assigning this one, but you're 100% sure they won't change any data in the system at all in here. So that's a very good role to actually have by adding that super read role inside the system in here. It's very good for also high-level people that should not really make a lot of damage by only giving the read permission in here. You can do I should go to this one. You can, of course, do a similar one for the one with the tools, allow one to execute all tools in the system also in here if you want. When you're looking at creating new roles in here, there's several concepts you could come up with and say, I want to make the user assignment real easy. I want to create one role that is everything a user can do in the system. First of all, it will be really tedious to get that done, and it will be really tedious that it also works in all cases. And if you later on want to remove something, it's actually very, very tough because you remove one thing and you don't really know what's breaking at that time. So instead of when you're actually designing roles, focus on one little task like editing a customer, creating ship to's, creating a sales order, releasing a sales order. Things like that one makes it very simple to get the permissions right, and it also makes the test very simple. And if you in the future upgrade or get a roll-up updates put in or new customizations, there's actually quite a small chance that all your roles is going to be broken. There's going to be a few of them that maybe don't work, but it's not that every user in the system can't work in that. And that would be the case for these very large roles because they would touch almost anything all the time. Another thing, you shouldn't really make it for each user. You should probably make it for a group of users at that time also, and you can very easily do that one. I will show you with the Easy Security Lite product, we actually have a way of combining all these roles into a single role, all roles, but with the functions in Easy Security Lite, just to take a role with all the permissions to accomplish the thing that is nice, having a role that is easy to assign to the users, but you're still maintaining them in a way where you actually can move forward with your security also at that point. Another thing we have seen is that role centers and permissions are kind of mixed up sometimes. Because some people will say, oh, if people have the order processor role center, they should be able to do every function in there. Every function, is that meaning going into a sales order and posting the invoice on it also? It really isn't. A role center gives you access to view information, and it improves the usability by only having the menu items you actually need in there. But it's really not part of the security. It's the way that users see the system in here. So you have a role center, give them as usability, and then you give them access to perform tasks after that one in here. If you look at the role basic in NAV 2013, by the way, it's not a very good concept because they have actually done 3 things in that role. First of all, getting able to log in and log out of the system, and that's fine. The next thing they have is to execute objects, and that's okay again, it's like that's something people need, all people need. But then they have given access to read a lot of data, and that's actually because they have given all the permissions to the order processor roles, the one called basic. And we look at the first lines up here. I don't think every company want every user in the system to see all customers, to see all items, to see all sales orders, purchase headers, and so on. So there's actually a huge amount of information in here that is being added in this one. And really a lot of these things, yeah, they're used in the role center, but it should have been a role by itself. And each role center should probably have a role by itself, only having the read permission necessary for those pages. You don't want probably your salespeople to see your purchase orders because then they can see the cost price or when you're going to order them again maybe, and that's maybe not what you want salespeople to see in here. So be careful with the basic role in here because it has too many permissions to read data if you're really trying to protect the access to that one in here. If we look at the versions of NAV in here, we could also include the classic in the 2009 example up here because it actually uses the exact same way. In 2009, the user connect directly to the SQL database. They need access in the SQL database, in each database that they're going to access in there. And for the Rotor client, it's quite a complex setup to actually allow that one by using the service tier. And in that case, you both have NAV and the SQL database verify user credentials in here. It also means if you're trying to open Excel and open data sources, as a user, you have direct access to the data, and you can actually now go take a look at it from Excel or any other thing that can actually use these data connections in here. In 2013, a lot of things was improved on that one. First of all, it's a service that connects to the database. So maybe you only need 1 or 2 users that have even access to that database, the one that do backup and the one that the service tier is using actually. So each individual user will not be able to bypass NAV security. There's no way around it. They can read the data directly from the database, even if they know the SQL Server name. They also only need 1 user inside the SQL database, and when you log into NAV, the service tier is actually the one verifying the user in that. So you can even create users that are only inside NAV. It's a lot like in the native database of NAV, you have database users, and you just type in the username and the password, and that's a way for the user to get into the system now. It's very, very helpful for external users that is not part of your domain, for example, to run that way. Another great thing about 2013 is actually if you change people's security, in almost every case, it immediately applies. So there's no reason to close the client and open the client again. The permission just applies right away, actually. So that's a very, very nice thing also. The signing require access to the SQL database in 2013, and that's kind of where it's like if you just modifying reports, you actually end up getting kind of the old permissions that you had in 2009 environments, where you can actually do more than you're supposed to in there. But for the general user, it's a real huge improvement with the 2013 way of accessing the SQL database. I mentioned a little earlier that you can do security filters. And the way it actually works is that you do filters directly against the SQL database. And if I go in here and look at one of my permission sets, for example, in here, I have a field out here called security filter. And it actually is very nice in here. I can go in and say for my, I'll have my global dimension filter, or global dimension code in here. It's of course called department in here. That's why I find it. Let's I'll just go in and use my customer posting group instead. If I can find it on here. Didn't matter anyway. I'm not going to show how it works in here. But then I can go in and apply a filter and say it must be bigger than 100, for example, in my customer balance in here. This filter have a, oh, I looked at the currency code instead of the customer table. That's why all the fields I was looking for didn't exist in here. But really, this filter applies in the SQL database. So it has a lot of bad side effects. First of all, if you filter out customers and you're trying to post a sales order for that customer, it will just tell you the customer don't exist. If you filter out entries, maybe you can't see the last year entry, and then when you post, it will come up and say the entry already exists and so on. Inventory evaluation can also be completely messed up, and it's probably not something you want to do for the higher level users that will run these things, but you have to be really careful with these kind of things also in here. And the one thing that really makes it tough is if you're just looking at limiting the read ability for people. If they have two roles, one with a security filter and one without a security filter, the one without is actually the one that wins in that scenario. So that's one thing that makes it tough to actually do that one. In 2013, you can actually correct the code to avoid some of these issues, but Microsoft haven't done anything in the standard NAV actually to avoid these kind of things in here. So one last thing in 2009 is the enhanced versus the standard security in here. And really when you do enhanced, it sounds like it's much better security, but it really isn't. It only gives you a lot of issues when running it in here. If you run standards, security is checked by the NAV clients. Same happens when you do enhanced, but it would actually try to mimic those permissions on the SQL tables. It's only being used when you connect from NAV, not if you connect from Excel. So it's not like it's going to make a huge difference for you. The thing that it is, you need to synchronize these permissions, because if they're out of sync, you maybe gave the user permission in NAV, but you didn't sync with SQL, and now they don't have permission anyway. So it really don't benefit you anything to use the enhanced one. It's just the standard default in here. And by the way, Microsoft removed the enhanced in the 2013 environment. It don't even exist any longer. It only uses NAV inside NAV now, so or security inside NAV. Let's just take a look at it here. And this one is a 2009 environment. And where you actually will go look at that setting is under File Database Alter up here. And you would go in and look at security model, and it can either be standard or enhanced in here. If currently is set for enhanced, you need to do all that synchronizing, and you can actually switch this one to standard pretty easily. If you're the only one on the database, you mark it single user, and then you mark it as standard. Then it goes through a process. It removes all the permissions in SQL, and then you're now running standard, only having NAV that tests the security actually in here. Same thing goes for the Rotor client in 2009 also, that it all applies the exact same way in here. There really is no reason to use the enhanced one. It just causes you issues about synchronizing all the time. The last thing is, I mentioned permissions as roles and access controls and so on. That's one thing that overrides everything else that is in there, and that's basically the license. A user can never exceed the permissions in the license. So if your license only gives you access to run the standard NAV application and not warehousing, just because you give the user super don't mean they can run warehousing. So that these two things always works together in here. And the indirect permission, I actually used a lot to protect information inside NAV in here. There is a table inside, and I'll just use a classic environment in here because it's a little easier to just do a form on the fly. It's called license permission, and I can create a form. You don't even require that you actually save it. I can just finish this one, and then I can just run it in here. And I will see for a lot of the tables down here, I'm running on a developer license right now, so you won't really see it. But if I was actually using a customer license, you see many of these tables. 110 is posted. It's shipment header. I would see I only have indirect insert, indirect modify, and indirect delete in here. So whatever user of permission, the license is going to say, no, you're only going to get half of that, or half permission in here. And in that way, suddenly the code is actually in control of which tables the user can change. And that's one of the reasons you just can't run the GL entries and start modifying data in there. If you buy the solution developer, you have a license like the one I just showed in here, and suddenly you actually get that access for all the users also. So be real careful with setup when you actually do that one, because suddenly that last stopping block actually gets removed by giving that last piece of access in here. Menu items are, by the way, also removed based on license. So if you don't have license for them, you won't see the menu items. It works that way in Classic, even for the user permissions. That, by the way, is optional. In RTC, it works for the license permission in 2013, and in future versions, or it will actually even work for user-based licensing also, or user-based permissions also in here.